compared the likes of Musk and Thiel to sort of Napoleonic figures who are trying to basically become sort of modern heroes in the most literal sense of the term of a hero, who will basically bend history to their will in one way or another. And they're going to do so through these companies that they describe themselves as the founders of. They don't call themselves CEOs or businessmen, they're founders, and they're trying to found empires. And I think that what Musk is doing is simply taking that logic and moving it into the state.
Sometimes you've just got to take a step back and ask yourself, what's going on? With Trump in the White House and Elon Musk everywhere else, great power politics are back. I'm joined by Professor Will Davies, author of The Happiness Industry and Nervous States, to ask whether we've exited neoliberalism and entered into a new era of something else. We talk about Adam Tooze, Peter Thiel, and why Rachel Reeves hates newts so much. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. Will Davies, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
It's a pleasure to be here.
I'm such a big fan of your writing, and I've been wanting to get you on for like a big State of the Nation interview, but then things kept happening. And my first question is, do you think that we, in the West at least, are in the middle of a historic vibe shift?
I mean, whether that's the right frame, I'm not entirely sure. I think it's useful. I don't think it's a useless concept, the vibe shift. And in some ways, it's partly about what I was trying to get at in my book, Nervous States, which came out in 2018 and was partly about the displacement of facts, as in representations of reality that are relatively static, stable, and can be kind of moved around from academic journal to newspaper to public sphere and remain intact, and they're a bit like sort of photographs of the world. They don't constantly change. From that to a kind of data-based understanding of knowledge, where things are kind of in constant flux, and you've constantly got some sense of a vibe, and you've got some sense of sentiment analysis. What are the markets saying? What's trending on Twitter? This sort of thing. So I think that shift in the fact that we are now sort of more vibe-based, I do totally buy. In terms of a sort of more of, I guess, what Marxists and other political economists have understood as crisis, which is more about a kind of paradigm shift than a vibe shift from one hegemonic way of running the world to a new hegemonic way of running the world. There's been a lot of anticipation of that for quite a long time. I mean, obviously, 9/11 could have been considered to be that the kind of interruption. Clearly, 2008-9, the global financial crisis, is the one that political economists are going to carry on privileging as being the kind of key moment when neoliberalism hit its potentially fatal, perhaps not fatal, legitimacy crisis. But then we had 2016, which felt like a huge rupture, the democratic uprisings of Brexit and the first Trump presidency. And then we had COVID, and now we've got another Trump presidency that, as we're speaking today, seems to be entering something pretty unprecedented, with Elon Musk charging around the Treasury Department, pulling plugs out of sockets and seeing what he can do with it. So we've been living with this for quite some time, but certainly, we are in uncharted territory.
I would definitely want to come back to this idea of how you frame crisis, because there's the beef of the ages. It wasn't Kendrick Lamar and Drake. It was, of course, Perry Anderson and Adam Tooze. We're going to come back to that in a second. Fewer diss tracks, though, I found. Fewer diss tracks.
Well, you never know. I mean, I'm sure that if they had the right kind of, maybe Novara could offer to sort of host something.
Maybe Perry Anderson's going to drop a 616. I mean, the big news this week, and God knows what will have happened by the weekend, which is when this interview will come out. The big news this week is the imposition of tariffs on goods imported by the US from Canada, Mexico, and China. Obviously, the question generated by that is that globalisation finito, right? America has said, we're not going to import so many of your goods. We're not going to be the world's market anymore. Is that the end of an era?
I mean, that era was already being kind of, the death rights of that era have been already proclaimed, actually. I mean, the Biden administration really ratcheted up the trade wars of the first Trump administration in trying to basically reduce reliance on Chinese imports in particularly strategically important areas, most importantly chips, but also things like green energy production technologies and so on. So you could say that things have been heading in that direction for a while. And one of the other interesting things about the Biden administration is that it had quite a few of these sort of, it was quite stylized in its own intellectual vision in a way that Trump and Musk are not. But it had these people like Jake Sullivan and Janet Yellen going around giving these speeches saying the age of globalization is over and saying the age of, I don't know if they ever said neoliberalism is over, but they said a lot of these sorts of things. And they really tried to make these big statement speeches. Rachel Reeves, the chancellor here, kind of followed in on their coattails and gave a couple of speeches in 2023 about the end of kind of untrammeled globalization, onshoring, friendshoring, which is where you try to reduce your reliance on potentially hostile overseas powers, most importantly Russia and its gas. So that the rhetoric has been in circulation for quite a while. The tariffs clearly is now it's a much more kind of erratic set of interventions, because the whole point of the Sullivan Yellen Reeves agenda was to basically mesh geopolitical strategy with political economy in ways you could say has happened at lots of times over history, but that was what they were very explicitly trying to do. Now, in what universe is Canada a kind of geopolitical adversary of the United States? I mean, it's sort of broken free.
It's just polite America.
Exactly, and also sort of picking fights with Denmark as well. You sort of think like there's something which seems to rile Trump. I mean, there may be strategic reasons to want to take control of Greenland, but there's also something quite interesting, which is that if people say we believe in masculine virtues, like Mark Zuckerberg has now rather unconvincingly come along and done, immediately they're sort of okay with us and they're sort of part of the gang kind of thing. But it's these sort of figures like Trudeau, who is, I'm not going to call him woke, which is no doubt what Trump would do.
He's a wetty.
But he's a liberal, and he's not apologetic about that particularly. And there's something about these kinds of political figures that now seem to kind of draw draw his ire. Whereas you think back to the first administration, 5-6 years ago, he was sort of getting into stupid sort of Twitter battles with North Korea and that sort of thing. It was pretty terrifying at the time. But there's a logic that has broken out now relating to tariffs, which I don't think we certainly didn't see that anything like that under the Biden administration.
The way in which my colleague Aaron Bastani puts it, and I wonder what you think about this, is that Trump sees the world in terms of three apex predators. There's America, there's China, and there's Russia. And so the reason why Trump's going for Mexico and for Canada and for Denmark and whoever else it may be is to say, oi, I'm the biggest lad in this prison yard.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure there's something about that. If you were to try and impose a kind of, IR, international relations logic upon it, you could say that we have sort of the era of the nation state as we understand it, which is not actually it's a relatively recent era. In some ways, if you trace it back to the loss of empires in the post-war period, you could say, and this is what people like David Edgerton have written about, how Britain as we understand it as a nation state really just dates back to the kind of 1960s, really. So you could say that actually we're now returning to something that has probably been the more normal model of political modernity, which is something more like, these kind of competing empires, geopolitical blocks on a larger scale. So I'm sure there's something in that. I mean, Trump himself, though, that he's very, very difficult. I mean, he's behaving so erratically, and what comes out of his mouth is so hard to kind of predict and to really make sense of, and it's causing a lot of problems. I mean, particularly to people in financial markets to try and understand what does any of this mean. There's lots of disagreement about the pricing of the financial risks attached to his declarations. So. Stock markets. I mean, Goldman Sachs has recently said they think that the S&P 500 could lose 5% of its value if the tariffs are what they turn out, what Trump said they're going to be. But that hasn't happened. So that means that basically all of the people who are, buying and selling these shares don't really believe him at the moment. But I mean, perhaps people didn't believe that Musk was going to go into the Treasury Department and start trying to rewire the whole thing, and people were going to go into the Department of Justice and start sacking the January 6th investigators. So there seems to be more doing and less kind of rhetoric than there was in 2016, 2017.
I don't know if you're an ancient Rome guy, but I fucking love the History of Rome podcast that Mike Duncan made, because it's just like so dense and information rich. And one of the things that occurred to me as I was listening to the period covering Julius Caesar's rise to power and assassination was that this guy was something of a class traitor. And that's why people couldn't stand him. That's why many of the people in the Senate couldn't stand him. The things that he was doing were threatening some of their interests, but represented not a widening of democracy or a flattening of inequality. It was a huge power grab, but it meant pissing off some of those vested interests.
Yeah.
I mean, are there some parallels to be drawn with Trump and with Musk, that they've got a willingness to say, all right, we're going to knock 5%, off the, total value. We're going to imperil, many of your trading interests. But it's to usher in this next thing that comes in, which is much more authoritarian, much less democratic.
Sure. And that's why I think some people have been returning to Naomi Klein's shock doctrine as a kind of as a possible explanation as to what's going on, which is, and of course, when we haven't really started talking about Silicon Valley yet, but there is a sense in which Silicon Valley has always sort of acted first and asked for permission later. I mean, that's the kind of, and they're quite clear about that. I mean, Peter Thiel has been clear about that. Mark Zuckerberg, move fast and break things being the early slogan of Facebook. So there's certainly a sense that you need to be ahead of the curve and that you're smashing things up. You can't make an omelette without breaking eggs. So some version of shock therapy. What I suppose, and this is where, I'm not someone who has tried to kind of dig deep into the kind of what Musk actually thinks and wants to do. And I haven't gone and read the whole 900 pages of Project 2025. I've looked at some of it. And there are quite a lot of clues in...
Put it through DeepSeek for...
Yeah, I'll do that, exactly. I'll to condense this. And there are lots of clues as to where they're trying to get to. And it's not something that I think most people, including probably, most Trump voters, if they knew any of this, would want to live with. But it certainly could empower them and their allies. I think the frightening thing, if in terms of the future of American democracy, and I don't want to sound alarmist about this, but one of the ways in which liberal democracy works is you have this thing called government, which is basically a set of administrative institutions, and they are quote unquote non-political in the sense that they are staffed by permanent civil servants who basically they have a career in the government and they work equally well regardless of who's in power. And this ensures that basically you run this thing with a view to thinking, well, at some point I'm going to have to hand it over. So I'm not going to act like a tyrant, because otherwise it's going to come back and bite me at some later date. Now, if you look at the way in which Trump and Musk are already behaving, is that they've broken that contract. Now, again, I don't want to sort of romanticize that or idolize saying this was wonderful and this was didn't have any sort of occlusions or injustices. Of course, it did. But what Trump and Musk are currently doing is imposing a logic of revenge and loyalty onto a set of institutions that in the past were perceived to have to obey their own logic, because at some point the other party was going to be in charge of them. And the only way you would allow revenge and loyalty to become a governing logic of something like the Department of Justice is if you believed that you weren't going to have to hand it over to another political party in the future. Now that, again, obviously there's all sorts of things that might happen in the coming weeks and months and so on, and Musk and Trump could fall out at any moment and so on. But certainly at the moment, they seem to be governing in a way that they don't believe that model of liberal government, which actually, if you trace it the whole way back to its origins, it traces back to sort of early political modernity in the 17th century, that they don't believe that idea of there being these administrative institutions that are separate from politics, quote unquote, that's done basically, and they're moving into something that is either more monarchical or or closer to a sort of Silicon Valley vision of the founder. Obviously, someone like Peter Thiel, in his ideology, the vision of the monarch and the vision of the entrepreneurial founder kind of come together in some way. So, again, that might sound alarmist, but I do think there are sort of signs of that logic at work at the moment. I
mean, so you've got lots of things happening at once. So, you've got Silicon Valley, you've got Silicon Valley figures moving into government like Elon Musk. And then you've also got, coming back to the language of the vibe shift, which I'm using in a kind of tongue-in-cheek way, but, this poll which showed that, half of young people 18 to 27 weren't interested in democracy anymore, had become disenchanted, thought that, parliament, democratic processes were pointless. I suppose I've got two questions. One is, Where do you think that comes from? Is it just one poll? And if you framed it another way, you'd get the opposite answer. Or is there something significant about this weakening of attachment to democracy?
So on the poll, I mean, I think it is a bit of a slightly dodgy poll, but I mean, I don't want to get so head up on that because clearly, we're talking about a possible vibe shift. We don't need to get too head up on a single poll. I do think that there are some
the prerogative of the humanities department. I'm like, look,
yeah,
this
exactly.
is the data.
Yeah, exactly. It looks like a poll. No, I mean it's but there have been other polls of that sort that have shown some of those sorts of trends, this has been something that some political scientists in the States have been worried about for some time and so on. So now, I mean, the first thing to say, and I'm here with Novara, so this is kind of like almost what Novara has. It's almost its raison d'etre for the last sort of 10, 15 years, however long it's been, which is to say, well, actually, those generations have been being screwed over economically, and if they're no longer willing to participate in this thing called liberal democracy, well, why are you surprised? I mean, there's a sort of a clear kind of gerontocracy, a sort of rule of the old that has, particularly in a country like Britain, has been dominating since the 1990s, and the Conservative Party are now sort of dwindling. The big question then is, in this country, could reform become a young person's party? This is one of the big electoral questions.
What do you think?
I think it certainly could. I mean, I think, and you just look at the continent where the far-right parties pick up, in France, Le Pen is more popular amongst the young than she is with the old. Everyone always assumed the opposite about Farage, and clearly Brexit was a movement of, largely of the over 50s or over 60s, and clearly the vast majority of people under the age of 30 voted against Brexit. But the question is, could, when we saw what happened in Rotherham and other cities in the north over the last summer of these, far right on the streets, we know there's a huge amount of pent-up anger in this country about lots of things, and it's been there for a long time. This isn't a recent phenomenon. I mean, I came across a description of the 2011 riots the other day in something I was reading, and there were all these quotes about the feelings of hopelessness and the alienation and the having no future and not being able to achieve economic security and this sort of stuff. And that was 2011, and it was 14 years ago. Now those tended to be sort of riots of the inner cities, and they were not kind of this what are more in these much more, in some ways, more economically abandoned places, the towns and the sort of deindustrialized regions of the northeast and so on. But that anger has been there for a hell of a long time. Now, sorry, in answer to your question, I do think that reform could become a young person's party. I think it depends partly on how they start to present themselves differently, how they use different media in a cannier way. I mean, they can't just carry on relying on the Telegraph, as willing as the Telegraph would be to prop up their support. The question is, to what extent could you start to, there are young working class people who, by and large, do not vote in this country, and that's been the case really since Blair. I mean, that's where when we look at these turnouts of approaching 50%, so you've got almost 50% of the country not voting. That's and obviously Corbynism was partly about trying to kind of bring some of those people back into democracy, but you could also imagine reform approaching the same problem. I
mean, anecdotally, it's something which I'm coming across even within my own family. Young people who are white, didn't go to university, are finding themselves more attracted to reform, and there isn't another pole of attraction for them. There isn't another challenger party. I definitely do want to come back to Silicon Valley, but just sticking with reform for a second, how important is it for political parties, whether they're sort of hyper leader parties or something a bit more movement driven, how important is it for them to be able to embody the sentiment of what it is people feel?
Yeah.
Because this is the thing which strikes me about reform, which is they feel anger with you. And there is something very masculine about it. When I'm up against a reform person on a panel show, they're jumping over you, they're interrupting. They're like ingrown hairs, right? They're angry people. And you come across someone from the Green Party and they're like, even if you eat meat, you're a vegetarian. Do you know what I mean? It's a totally different totally different kind of affect.
Yeah.
So how important is that sort of,
Yeah.
I guess, not just mirroring of sentiment, but embodying of it?
Yeah, no, I definitely. I mean, the question is absolutely that's important, and it's a major problem that Labour has got, which is their leadership doesn't really embody anything that people can kind of relate to, and that's not Starmer or Reeves's fault, but I think we have to see that that's one of the problems that they're up against. I definitely think that clearly leadership is something that can, and leadership in the age of social media and declining trust in the mainstream media and declining trust in politics and government and so on in general, there is an opportunity for certain kinds of leaders who are able to channel an affect, whether that's necessarily the most successful affect, the one you just described. I can well imagine it. I mean, I can imagine. I know who these people are. I've seen them on Question Time and that sort of stuff. There is something that I think anger is definitely there. But I think it's not just your sort of white 60-something small business male from Kent who's angry. There's a lot of other people who are angry as well. And if reform becomes only associated with the angry white 60-something small businessman from Kent, it actually won't be able to grow as much as I think it possibly could. Because I think there's a lot of young people who are also angry, but possibly not in the same way. And there's women who are angry. And there's issues to do with not allow. So I think the far right could move in if it with more imagination. I think it could embody other affects. I think that the affect which I think so many people feel and which so many political parties are kind of dancing around or trying to grab is a kind of paradoxical one, which is sort of libertarian. Well, it's libertarianism and authoritarianism. Now, there is a libertarian authoritarian model, which is, you could say, is partly what someone like Musk is currently pursuing. But
you're allowed to say the N-word. You're not allowed to do protesting. Is that the sort of?
I suppose, yes. I mean, that's one neat way of putting it. I mean, I think there's a sort of. There's. It's partly about trying to let nature take over again, and we sort of assume that there are certain natural hierarchies regarding gender, race, age, and some of them sort of bleed into kind of cultural hierarchies in various ways, and that what's required is a libertarianism that allows those sedimented hierarchies to somehow sort of resurface from the sort of awfulness of the last sort of, well, certainly since the 60s, but possibly since the 1920s, and that they need to be sort of allowed to kind of breathe again. And I think that's clearly in what's happening with the Republican Party now. The Republican Party has become a libertarian, authoritarian party. I don't think people in Britain quite want that, but I think they feel a sense of like, this government is completely useless. Why don't they leave me alone? And also, why can't someone come along and sort this out, sort of thing, which is a sort of paradox, which is wanting kind of less and wanting a lot more all at the same time. And obviously people want the NHS and they want police and they want borders and they want various, and they also want their life to make sense. And they also want, careers to go back to making sense like they did in, back in the sort of 1960s or 1970s and whenever you're thinking back to. And they want some coherence back, and they just want to sort of sweep everything away and then reimpose something else. But it's very rarely a coherent combination, but it's a sort of a desire. So in a way, what was clever about Take Back Control with Brexit was that it spoke directly to that, which is we're going to allow the ordinary people to take back control, and we're going to do it for them. So it's like, well, who's actually taking back control here? And that is in some ways the paradoxical, but also quite sort of ingenious rhetoric of populism in general, is to say, you now have the power, and I'm here to exercise it for you, sort of thing.
Why is it that immigration becomes the totemic either image or example of a loss of control?
Well, I suppose there's. I mean, so obviously there's an idea of there being this border that should be sort of, we should be allowed to decide who comes in and who doesn't come in, kind of thing. And the small boat is basically the symbol of someone who's basically breaking rules in some fundamental way, and they're all cheating and lying and that sort of thing. I mean, immigration has been something that has been drip fed to people for a long time by the newspapers as being the reason why the NHS is not functioning as well as it should, despite what we know of the reliance of the NHS on immigrant and second generation migrant labour ever since its founding. So people have been given that as an explanation. I suppose, and I mean, it's curious. I mean, obviously, Britain has undergone. I'd be careful if I exaggerate this, but my understanding, it's the biggest wave of net migration in its history since the beginning of the Johnson administration. Since the ends of lockdown, Cameron was promising to bring net migration, so that's the number coming into the country minus the number going out, down to below 100,000, and he could never manage to get it down below about 250. But under the Johnson administration, it was running about 700,000, and basically that was because loads of European people felt understandably unwelcome, went back to Europe. There were lots of jobs that needed filling. It was basically to do with partly
27 other countries I can go to.
No, absolutely. But huge levels of immigration were then required in order to, fill vacancies in the care sector, in the NHS. And there was also the launch of the graduate visa by the Johnson administration. So that happened actually incredibly quietly. So what exactly people are angry about when they get angry about immigration is not quite clear, because I imagine people used to get very unhappy about, the idea of the kind of Polish fruit picker in Boston, Lincolnshire, or something like that. Certain towns around East Anglia that had become changed in their cultural quality as a result of the EU enlargement and free movement. Now there must, we've had far more immigration in recent years. I haven't heard that really. It hasn't really been sort of kind of debated in quite the same way. It's the small boats which seems to resonate more, and I think that's the idea of something that is fundamentally unfair and illegal going on and criminal.
I mean, to go back to, the Silicon Valley lads, so Musk and Zuckerberg, Bezos, does the fact that they've piled in behind Trump represent something that they always wanted to do, but when, liberal DEI was in the ascendancy, they didn't have the space to? Or is this them just sort of doing what's most convenient?
I mean, people have analysed this, and people are trying to sort of make sense of, what... Certainly Musk is an unusual one, because Musk and the people who are known as the PayPal boys, whatever they're called.
PayPal Mafia.
PayPal Mafia, sorry. They did... So Thiel in particular thinks of himself as this great kind of reactionary intellectual philosopher. I mean, I don't know if you read his complete word salad garbage in the Financial Times a couple of weeks ago, which was just no one made it. It was almost like the FT had just sort of printed it to sort of show the world quite how crazy some of the people.
It's like when Andrew Tate talks, which is
Right.
There's lots of long words,
Right.
and that's like yes, you must be smart because you're using these long words. But I'm squinting at it,
Yeah,
being
yeah.
like, but syntax. This
Yeah.
doesn't make sense.
No, absolutely. But so there are I think Musk and Thiel are sort of a slightly separate case. I mean, my take on, say, Bezos is that he is an empire builder in his own right. He's been very close to the US government for quite a while in terms of the hosting of the cloud computing for the Pentagon is on Amazon servers, and all of these Google, Facebook, Amazon have a lot to gain from the government. Partly, they've had a lot to gain for quite a while by being left alone. I mean, that's obviously been something that has been absolutely crucial, is that they haven't been regulated for since their founding 20 plus years ago. And so that's important. So obviously, there's a lot of lobbying that's always had to go on to make sure they don't get antitrust investigations.
But also, they don't want Chinese competitors as the other part.
No, that's true. Yes, so they... and you could say that, obviously, their ability to basically engage in mass surveillance is partly a sort of geopolitical benefit to the US government in terms of the possible advantages in the AI race, which the US has suddenly had a shock in that respect in the last week or so. But no, I would see them as sort of behaving in a diplomatic fashion, in the sense that if you think of the we going into a kind of era of great power politics that you were referring to earlier, they are also kind of great power leaders in their own ways. they don't behave like normal businesses. They're not really engaged in competition for customers in the way that, the image of a business, according to liberal economics, is that everybody's sort of competing for customers by increasing quality or reducing prices or whatever it might be. They're behaving in a way that is much closer to sort of engaging in imperial land grabs of one kind or another, buying companies to shut them down, that kind of stuff. So they, I think, when I saw them all lined up at the inauguration like that, in a way it was a bit like having kind of foreign dignitaries there. It was a bit like, they weren't going to have like sort of Putin and, Xi and people lined up there, but it was a little bit like that they are now, the sort of friends of the administration, but running their own empires in their own way. And as I say, I think Musk, I wouldn't imagine Bezos as someone who would aspire to being a kind of philosopher king in the way that Thiel or Musk does, regardless of whether they've got anything interesting to say or think.
I mean, when it comes to what kind of power they wield, I mean, you talked about cloud computing infrastructure, like it's massive. What Amazon is so much more than a way for me to buy gochujang very easily. I mean, that's such a an increasingly small amount of how they make money. But there's also the control of communications infrastructure, the ability to change how people think, behave, relate to one another through that kind of control. I really enjoyed your LRB piece about reaction, and I like that you, like me, admitted to being a Twitter crackhead. And every time you're like, I'm off this platform, it's like, but I just need one more. I need one more bong rip.
Yeah.
What does it do to politics that so much of how I interact with the world around me and understand the world around me is being shaped through means that I'm not even aware of? I've got no idea how I'm being channeled into this mood or that mood.
Yeah. I mean, it's, it's something we've grown used to in a way, because how long has this been going now? I mean, it's I suppose smartphone was launched and became kind of mass, the use of algorithms to start manipulating feeds in, say, Facebook, and then later in Twitter, was sort of mid-2010s. I mean, there was a few relatively innocent years that Blue Sky now is sort of, recreating. I now do use Blue Sky, having not used Twitter for a while, but where there's sort of no algorithm involved. And in some ways it begins to feel rather sort of weird and clunky, because instead of this sort of like, you might like to look at this thing, which is the sort of TikTok model that now Facebook and Instagram and Twitter are sort of adopting. Instead, it is this rather sort of old-fashioned, clunky, steam-driven thing of like, everything just appears in the order that it got posted on. So in that sense, you kind of do know roughly what's going on and who you're following, who you're not following, and that kind of stuff. But yeah, I mean, these it's difficult to analyze and study the back end of these things because it's shrouded in so much secrecy. But there have been, political scientists try to understand the effect of being shown different forms of content in terms of, political affiliation and so on. And clearly, there are certain affects that generate better engagement than others. And unsurprisingly, the affect that seems to have the greatest political potency in terms of getting someone to sort of, join something and so on, sign up to something and vote and so on, is anger. And anger is generally a mood that is a result of what you might broadly call a norm breach. So that could be someone either turning up in a small boat in Kent, or it could be someone just jumping a queue at a bus stop, or it could be someone who's, not clearing up after their dog, or, someone who's basically probably knows what the rules are and is ignoring them. That's the, what starts to get people sort of itching to sort of do something. And I think, as we're both recovering Twitter.
You're in recovery. I'm still in the throes of addiction.
Okay, but it's often the thing that you've seen which is not right. It's like there was there was a very early cartoon about, it wasn't on the internet, No One Knows You're a Dog, which was one of the first ones back in the 90s. But there was another one, I think, from probably about 20 odd years ago now, where some guy was hunched over a computer.
Can't come to bed now, darling. Someone's wrong on the internet.
Exactly. And in a way, that remains the sort of the thing that keeps you coming back. Now, obviously, that's not, I think, TikTok, which I'm not a TikTok addict. TikTok, obviously, is a much more kind of... there's more nuance going on in a way, because it's TikTok is constantly tailoring feeds for people's around people's behaviour. And one thing they have said in their own communications is that the most important data points that they're using are not things that you've ever said about yourself, like your age or your interests, or even I think necessarily what you click on to some extent. It's all these other things that they're taking into account to do with the speed at which you're scrolling, also the time of day, other circumstantial factors that are going on where they're trying to build up. I mean, they're not interested in you as an individual. They're interested in you as a type of amongst millions and millions of other individuals. But what they're doing is drawing on circumstantial data in order to tailor what you see, basically.
It's funny because my Instagram knows I'm a woman and shows me more feminized content. So animals who are best friends and recipes and blah, 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 blah. My YouTube thinks I'm a man because I watch a lot of woodworking videos to fall asleep. So it just sends me like, okay, you've got more woodworking, you've got some Roman Empire stuff, and then you've got why women are lying bitches. And I'm like, I was like, oh, you really think I'm a man? I mean, just to move things on a bit, your book, Nervous States, which we mentioned earlier, it talks a lot about the role of experts in politics, how a backlash has been driven by their perceived arrogance, by the sense of, well, I'm the expert, so I'm going to tell you what's politically possible. What, if anything, has changed since you wrote the book?
I think some of, I don't want to sort of claim too much sort of foresight because I was only kind of in that book, which was broadly written in that moment of one of the other crises of the last sort of 20 years, which was the kind of 2016, 2017 phase when everything seemed up in the air democratically. I mean, Corbyn was leader of the Labour Party, the Brexit referendum happened, Trump had got in and so on. And it did seem like there was suddenly certain kind of the liberal centre had sort of lost control in some way, which was both quite exciting and quite disorientating in lots of ways, and sometimes quite frightening in other ways because of there are bad people who can come and exploit these situations as well as good people. But I think that one of the things I was trying to get across there was, I mean, I was staggered in the aftermath of the Brexit referendum by how much trust people had that politics will ultimately follow sort of headline economic indicators, and nobody would ever pursue some path that will harm economic growth, which is clearly what Brexit was. Everyone knew it was going to be that. I'm not saying all the voters necessarily knew that, but there was a pretty good consensus.
There was a pretty amazing piece of polling that I remember was that there were a significant portion of Leave voters who would take a massive hit to their own personal finances to bring down immigration.
Right,
People had this sense of like, yes, there's going to be short-term pain, but I'm up for it.
Well, Farage said that, and there was, I think Tim Bales did this work on the the Conservative Party membership, which was particularly significant given that they were going to basically elect they didn't elect May, but they elected Johnson and they elected Truss. And they really were your, 60-something angry small businessman from Kent. And they, in some of the work that Bale did on the membership, it showed that people were willing to, forego real economic advantages but also just to get Brexit fully done. They were willing to rip everything up, basically. And that was, again, a sense, I suppose, of a certain kind of norm breach, which was like, well, we voted for this thing, and 2 or 3 years later, you still haven't done it, and that's because you were a bunch of lying liberals. And so that was, again, that sense of that some rules are being broken here, and we will do anything to get those rules put back in place. I think, so back to the present. I mean, what happened with Biden losing that election was another classic case of thinking that the headline indicators were basically telling you all you needed to know about what was really going on the ground.
Line goes up.
Yes, exactly. Then afterwards, Adam Tooze in his Substack had some quite good kind of slight mea culpa stuff, because he basically had thought that the macroeconomic management of the US under Biden was about as close to sort of perfect as it gets, really. He thought it was, not perfect, but that it was historically highly competent macroeconomic policy making, and then suddenly everybody said, no, we think the economy is terrible and we're going to basically oust the incumbent party. And Tooze went back and sort of picked through some of the inflation indicators, and one of the things that came out was that actually inflation on food and energy, the headline inflation rate had never got up much above 9% in the United States, but on food and energy it got up to, I think, 20 or 30%. And then inflation falls and the economists go, it's back down to 2% again. It's like, yeah, but the prices haven't fallen. The prices are still where they are, where they go up to where they got to. And so I think there was huge naivety around what sort of these kind of big statistics, big macroeconomic indicators were telling in terms of the state of the economy. And there's been quite a lot of having to kind of reckon with that. And that was one of the things that my nervous states was partly about, was that our statistics beginning, because they're sort of big and assume these large homogenous entities called nations. And after all, GDP is an artifact of World War II. It was born at a time when effectively nations were at war with each other, and you needed to have a way of capturing the overall rate of economic activity in this big homogenous mass where everyone was assumed to be broadly on the same side as the other people in that mass. That's not the world we live in any longer. There's no reason to think that those sorts of indicators should still do all of the work that we need them to. And I think Labour is, also now in this kind of whole rush for growth, is often getting quite confused about what it really, how to do it, what it means by that, who it really expects to benefit from it. So growth as a sort of a predictor of what's going to happen politically, I think has fallen away a bit. I think in terms of the other aspects of the book, I think, I compared in that book, I compared the likes of Musk and Thiel to sort of Napoleonic figures who are trying to basically become sort of modern heroes in the most literal sense of the term of a hero, who will basically bend history to their will in one way or another. And they're going to do so through these companies that they describe themselves as the founders of. They don't call themselves CEOs or businessmen, they're founders, and they're trying to found empires. And I think that what Musk is doing is simply taking that logic and moving it into the state.
Let's talk a bit about Labour, because you've got Rachel Reeves, and on the one hand, she's saying, fuck the environmental impact reports, fuck the bats, fuck the newts, I'll fuck up any newt I see. But on the other hand, so much of her spending plans, it's totally conditional on what the OBR says. So what's that about? Because on the one hand, she's saying, I want to rip up all these stupid rules. But on the other, she's saying, well, here's the sort of fiscal straitjacket I'm voluntarily putting myself in. Do you think that in Labour they understand the contradiction between those things? Or
I'm not sure they're necessarily a contradiction, because one is to do with macro financial accounting, where effectively what they're trying to do is to retain the credibility of the bond markets, because if they lose
that went well.
Well, it went well for a bit. It then obviously it had a bit of a wobble over the sort of Christmas period. So when they describe these fiscal straitjackets, what they're basically doing is doffing their cap to the international financial markets and the bond markets in particular. These other things that they want to become unleashed from, which is the sort of term that I suppose they probably can't use that term because it brings up too many memories of Liz Truss, because there was a huge amount of talk of unleashing. There was a lot of sort of, and Johnson as well. Wasn't it in his book called Unleashed?
Britain Unleashed.
Right, yeah.
And then there was also Britannia Unchained.
Of course, exactly. So there was this real sort of, rather kind of suspect idea that they've sort of, that someone is kind of dominating them and sort of, tying them up, chaining them up and so on, and that they're going to sort of rip all this stuff off. Now, when it comes to the planning agenda for Labour, the straitjacket is obviously not the one of sort of fiscal rectitude that they're aspiring to achieve in the eyes of the bond markets via the OBR, because basically the Office for Budget Responsibility has the power to say, whether or not what they're saying kind of makes sense or what kind of sense it makes. I think in a way what they're going for is a kind of a supply side agenda, but in relation specifically to regulation. Because, the original supply-side vision of Reagan and Thatcher in the early 80s was if you slash taxes on capital and the rich, you're going to get more investment because, they're not spending their money or investing their money because they're worried they're not going to get to keep enough of it at the end of it. And if we cut taxes on them, they're going to suddenly release all of this money that they've been kind of hoarding somewhere.
Rather than being like, 20 quid, that's
yeah, exactly.
nice.
It's like, we'll spend that on a new, railway and a new green sort of, energy infrastructure and so on. Whereas this would be more that the problem is that regulation, the paperwork and the opportunities to block things has become too endemic in the UK. So that's really what they're focusing on, is that they hope that the OBR is wrong, basically, because they hope that if they can really shake up the planning system, and they've even gone and done a weird sort of putsch in the Consumer and Markets Authority, which is the antitrust competition regulator, where they basically got rid of the previous guy who didn't seem to have done anything wrong and replaced him with someone who formerly worked at Amazon, which in a way I think is a sort of signaling to international capital of what kind of people they are. I think it's a sort of way of, because there's no real logic to it. It's a way of saying we're now open to having a conversation with oligarchs, effectively.
It's a moment that you pick up on, I think, in one of your LRB pieces, which is, Angela Rayner sort of linking arms with, BlackRock CEO Larry Fink. Does that mean Securonomics is over? That all this thing of like, well, we're going to, be less dependent on, the fickleness of other countries and larger markets. Is that over? Because then said they're like, please, Mr. BlackRock, will you buy up our lovely infrastructure?
The Securonomics thing, that was partly about geopolitics and international security. I think in a way that agenda is going to become more pressing, I'm afraid, in the future because of the security of Europe. And I think, Trump hasn't yet got to dealing with sort of NATO and things like that, because he's got too many other things to do. But at some point he's going to turn his attention to NATO, and it could be, it could be pretty difficult news for Europe in terms of its how it pays to keep itself safe. So if the thing to keep an eye on would be how things like asset managers and the investment community in general is incentivized or allowed in some case of some funds to get into arms investment, because that is that's not the situation at this precise moment, but Trump's been very clear about what he wants Europe to do in terms of defending itself. So that's another problem which is added to the list for Labour and all the other governments in Europe. But on top of how to achieve greater energy independence and this sort of thing. So that aspect of the Securonomics agenda is not going to go away. But of course there is this, sometimes somewhat paradoxical. They're even talking about Blue Labour coming back. Now, Blue Labour was the sort of seen as being the kind of, the anti-liberal, anti-neoliberal, anti-globalisation wing of the Labour Party, John Cruddas and Maurice Glassman and so on. Well, how do they come back at the same time as Larry Fink is coming into 10 Downing Street? That's another of the sort of weird kind of paradoxes. But I feel like Labour at the moment are sort of, they're being stretched in all sorts of directions because they need to fight Farage politically and culturally, but they also need to somehow try and create some greater room for fiscal manoeuvre. And they've got to worry about these kind of geopolitical and ecological crises, although ecology seems to have suddenly dropped off everybody's sort of list of priorities in the last sort of 6 months.
Well, isn't that because the minute that Trump's won, what's the point anymore of pursuing net zero by 2050? It feels very much that we're in a different moment from when much of the climate movement was looking at Boris Johnson and saying 2050 not enough.
Yeah. No, I feel like completely. It is surreal. It feels like things have started to go in completely the opposite direction of and it is pretty terrifying actually. God knows what we're currently on track for in terms of heating by the end of the century. It's probably absolutely terrifying. But China obviously is in some ways more important in terms of China's contribution to CO2 emissions over the last 20 years has been more important, and its ability to basically bring that down is also more important than what we in Europe and even what Trump does. So in that sense, it's not that it's not everything revolves entirely around Trump, but I do think that there's been a vibe shift on that. Just like on diversity, equality, and inclusion initiatives of sort of suddenly there's been this sort of screeching U-turn on, or certainly in the United States, and frighteningly, it feels a bit like something similar has happened when it comes to climate. So certainly on a rhetorical level. It might be that there are other things going on in the background, and it might be after all, Elon Musk has an interest in electric vehicles, and has an interest in kind of having the necessary infrastructure to support them and so on. So there are complicated interests at work here. But I do think that the public discourse around it is really grim at the moment.
There was something that Naomi Klein wrote recently, and I wonder what you think about it, which is that, what this political moment is defined by in the West is, okay, we're going to make you the chosen people. So you're going to be the ones to survive the disasters. You're going to have the, you don't have to worry about living within ecological limits. So we're not going to put that on you. And quite frankly, fuck the global south. What have they done for us anyway?
Absolutely.
And so it's about this sort of chosenness. We're going to make you the chosen people, and that's all there is to it. So, drill, baby, drill. Go for it. There's apparently pressure being put on Rachel Reeves to, exploit the Rosebank oil fields. I mean, do you think there's something in that, we had this little window of going, oh, maybe, the Paris Climate Accords are going to be important. Oh, maybe, net zero by 2050. And actually what there is now is just make sure that, you're on the top floor when the waters start rising.
Well, I think there's been some of that for quite a while. And I mean, people have studied, the things like the seasteading movement and, which is libertarians planning to live at sea, and Musk wanting, this is Milton Friedman's man
was not meant to live on sea. I don't have gills.
Well, they're sort of going to build these kind of like oil rig type things.
Oh, Jesus.
But then Musk and Mars is a sort of part of that. So there's been that sort of sense for a while that the question is not to sort of avert catastrophe or crisis. It's to sort of almost relish it, almost sort of see this as a way of putting everyone to the test in some ways.
Hard times make hard men.
Yeah, absolutely. And and there's money to be made as well. I mean, there's money to be made in a way that rewards first mover advantage and rewards speed. I mean, it's like crypto as well. Crypto has no the people who make money out of crypto are the people who get the information before everybody else, and then eventually things burst. But someone was there, and they were quick enough and brave enough and smart enough and informed enough to be in there at a time at the beginning of the bubble, and they ended up making the money out of everybody else. And so in that sense, it does turn capitalism into a zero-sum or maybe a negative-sum game ultimately. And you could say, and you see this in the work of people like Thiel, that liberalism has always misunderstood capitalism, because liberalism has always wanted to pacify capitalism and has always rewarded, I guess, what there are Austrian right-wing economists like Schumpeter and von Mises, who I write a bit about this in Nervous States actually, but for whom basically the correct understanding of capitalism is that it's closer to it's to see it as a derivative form of war rather than as a condition of peace, basically. And the liberals, the whole way through, from Thomas Hobbes through Adam Smith and right up to sort of Tony Blair or whatever, have had have had this false understanding of what capitalism is, and that's why they introduce all of these rules that muzzle people and stop them making money in ways that they want to, and so on. And that they pacify it and they feminize it as well, because that's the other thing is that, there's a very, very masculinist vision of what an entrepreneur is that runs through the work of Schumpeter and von Mises and is there in Thiel and no doubt in Musk. I mean, I find it sort of, when Zuckerberg comes out with this stuff, he doesn't quite pull it off in the same way, I think.
Someone said that he popped up looking like Drake's MDMA dealer, and I was like, yeah, no, you really, really do. But I guess on that, there's one of your pieces where you say the mistake that people always make is they think markets and capitalism are the same thing. And actually, you're not talking about a free exchange at all.
No, sure. So, this is an argument that's derivative from Fernand Braudel, the French historian, Marxist historian, where for Braudel, markets are a condition actually of many non-capitalist societies, and we can see elements of what we consider to be commercial culture the whole way back to medieval times. And effectively, an example of the market would be, people setting up their, people produce their wares out in the countryside or in their, small scale manufacturing plant. They bring it into the town and they all set up a stall and there's lots of buying and selling. And it's a bit like some market day, or it's a bit like what eBay users do when they're, buying and selling. And it's fun. And it's, you meet people, you chat to people, it's a bit like, I suppose you could say it's sort of gentrification works initially in these ways as well, which is sort of like, we've got a farmer's market, someone's selling their sort of crocheted kind of socks or something. And it's a sort of harking back to a kind of, but it's non-capitalist in the sense that you don't need capital in the sense of the capacity to leverage longer-term investments and to control property rights in intangible assets such as finance, intellectual property and this sort of thing, because effectively you're moving around small items and exchanging them for money, and that's what commerce is. Capitalism, Braudel argues, which really only originates, he argues, in the late 19th century, so much more recently than what most Marxist analyses, is really the capacity to control activity over time and space and to assert monopoly control in various ways. So Amazon would be an example of capitalism writ large, where effectively it's not seeking to be a trader in a market alongside other competitors. It's seeking to take some kind of proprietorial ownership over the conditions of other people's freedom. Now, that's, Henry Ford was a capitalist by that definition, but he was, there were sort of good aspects and bad aspects of Fordism, but ultimately what distinguished it as capitalism was the fact that it had a vision and a plan which controlled the conditions of both its workers and to some extent its consumers' options and its freedoms and their behaviours. And it exercised property rights over a brand, and over it also mobilised financial capital for the creation of large industrial infrastructures, and they built half of Dagenham. So that would be, so there's a huge difference of scale, but there's also a huge difference of transparency. This is the other thing that Braudel makes very clear, is that in a market everyone can see what's going on. So you sort of go, I could buy this donut is £3 and that one's £3.50. I'll go for this one, but whatever. Capitalism is distinguished partly by opacity and the inability for people to really understand everything that's going on. So information asymmetries, economists would say, but also kind of monopoly power, and this sense that hierarchies involved where it's not quite clear what decisions are going on and so on. So I'm not quite sure where I got into that lengthy kind of segue.
No.
I think Silicon Valley is a very clear example of how the logic of capitalism really breaks away from the logic of markets at a certain point.
So I think this brings us quite nicely to the beef of the century, Perry Anderson, Adam Tooze, which my husband over Christmas couldn't stop talking about. And I was really like, shut up, can we watch Home Alone? But when reluctantly I engaged with it, I was like, this is actually really interesting and seems to fit into, I think, a broader conversation that's happening, which is how do you define now? What is politically possible and necessary from this now, and what is it that's possible for us to know? And it seems to me that Adam Tooze takes the view that, well, actually there's just too much data happening simultaneously. These are all things acting on each other, and going back to your point about opacity, there's so much which cannot be known, right? And so you plonk yourself down in the middle of it. You try and make sense of it as best as you can, but you have to know that everything that you say is highly imperfect and highly limited. Yeah. Perry Anderson is sort of like, well, no, there's still this room for a structural analysis, and you're getting almost too overawed by the activities of these new I guess like these tech oligarchs, and you are sort of retreating from the train of what's politically possible. That's my summary of what the antagonism is between them. Where do you stand on it?
Well, I followed that debate. I read, so that it began with a critical article in the New Left Review by Perry Anderson about a series of Adam Tooze's books. And then there was sort of some response, and I don't think Anderson it wasn't any afters from Anderson as far as I remember. But Tooze found it very generative in terms of him thinking about what the hell am I doing, given that I'm not doing what Perry Anderson is doing. And Perry Anderson is of a generation of these extraordinary Marxist historians who, the extraordinary thing about Anderson is that he not just a historian. He also writes books about literature. He's also a philosopher. He, was crucial in bringing aspects of Western Marxism and continental theory to the English-speaking world. So his the range of what he's done is it's almost unthinkable that anyone could do that any longer, to be honest. There's a whole interesting question about the political economy of ideas in all of this, because Anderson comes from a position of huge privilege as well, partly generationally. I mean, they're the sort of the generation of the massive Hampstead houses and this, that's not obviously the main point, but it's not irrelevant. I mean, there's a sort of but they have a freedom that I'm an academic. Academics are just not left alone to get on and do that kind of stuff to that extent any longer. Adam Tooze is also a contemporary academic. I guess he's much younger than Anderson, and I don't know exactly what his teaching load or admin load is at Columbia. I imagine it's probably lower than most British academics, but obviously is able to sort of sift through all of this data. And I think both of them are, they do both offer this different idea of what totality or an aspiration to, not totality, but an aspiration to a sort of complete explanation might look like. I mean, by disposition, I'm closer to where Adam Tooze sits, in the sense that by disposition, I am less confident that I know what I know. I mean, that's partly about personality than anything else. I am more swept up by the now than someone like Anderson, who clearly, decides to go off and write a book about the historiography of World War One because he's in the mood, kind of thing, and it's not really influenced by the now. So dispositionally, I'm sympathetic to what Tooze is saying, and I think the other thing interesting about Tooze is that in his attempt to try and resolve the question of like what am I doing and what is now, he's ended up reaching for some of the sort of major social theory of the last sort of 40 years of people like Ulrich Beck, Bruno Latour, and these sorts of people who are kind of Latour's not really a sociologist, but they're far closer to sociology. I imagine Anderson holds these people in rather low regard, but and so it is an interesting one. I think that it. I
mean, on that idea of the past is becoming an increasingly bad indicator for what the future is going to be like, which to me seems to be where Tooze is at, and sort of saying that that the work that Marxists dedicate themselves to, which is I'm going to understand history so I can understand the present and the future, that's not what you should be doing anymore. Yeah. I mean, where do you sit there?
I mean, I think that the attempt to grasp what is genuinely unprecedented. I am not someone who is particularly drawn towards system thinking. And in that sense, I've never described myself as a Marxist. I mean, I read a lot of Marxist books and, output and, listen to, I think Anderson is an absolutely brilliant man who's made an absolutely extraordinary and actually unparalleled contribution to sort of theory and history in the Anglosphere. But yeah, I don't. The view from the mountaintop is one that I wonder. It owes itself to a certain I mean, I think this is Tooze's point, is that it owes itself to a tradition of critical thought that basically just claims too much epistemological power, basically. And I agree with that. I mean, that's partly the influence, I think, probably for Tooze, although he hasn't really mentioned this very much. But Foucault comes along in the 60s, 70s, and then influences a tradition that I know is very important to Adam Tooze, which is critical accounting studies, which might sound dull as hell, but it's actually really interesting. That effectively it's people who are working in accounting departments and understanding accounting as a practice of power and a practice of politics. Weirdly enough, there's a lot of them at LSE. I mean, and I know it was very important for Tooze, and it shapes a lot of his early work on statistics and so on. So there's basically a tradition that comes from French post-structuralism for understanding capitalism more as interlocking sets of technologies rather than as this kind of overarching logic of capital that we can broadly understand through Marx, and that is kind of still hasn't really it's changed in key ways, but that we assume that history is still following some kind of pattern. One of the main implications of Foucault is, and this is it could be for Nietzsche before Foucault, is that we don't fully understand who we are, and that to understand who we are, we need to understand ourselves through a whole series of accidents, and that's what genealogy does, and that's what Foucault's famous books like Discipline and Punish and The History of Sexuality tried to do, was to trace the various accidents and the various power games and the various acts of violence and often totally sort of illogical, sort of contingent events that suddenly left us with this being our present, and that and partly what I think where Foucault becomes a political resource is to unleash a slight sense of surprise as to, well, why are we like, whoa, we're like this, and it didn't have to be like this, and actually it doesn't make as much sense as we might have thought it made. And I think there's an element of that in Tooze's work, I think, in the sense that he's very good at both. He understands economics far better than I do, and most people do. But he also is alert to it as what Foucauldians would call a technology, which is that this is the instrument through which the world is governed in particular ways by particular centres of power. And in order to understand the world today, we need to, in a way, what Bruno Latour called follow the actors, which is that we need to read what the IMF is saying, not because the IMF is telling the truth, but because what the IMF says has various performative effects that actually are enmeshed in all sorts of other networks and performative effects. And I mean, I'm sorry that Marxists find all of that rather sort of troubling and so on, but as a way to maintain a sense of wonder with the world and a sense of urgency and curiosity and to grasp the urgency of the present, I find it more compelling than one which says, we are currently at this stage in this unfolding process that's been rolling for like 500 years or something like that.
I suppose my final question is the biggest one of all, which is we've covered so much ground. We've talked about America. We've talked about, Rachel Reeves. We've talked about, I guess, how possible is it to understand the society in which we live. And it's been all leading up to this, which is how would you define the era that we're living in?
Oh, gosh. I don't have a sort of an ism. I mean, I did a lot of work, and actually, some of my very early. I used to go on Novara sort of 10 years ago and talk about neoliberalism and with Aaron in sort of post-crash kind of era, and I did a lot of work on neoliberalism, and I was quite interested in it. I think probably what remains my statement on that, if you like, is that we're living with the instruments of neoliberalism lying around us, but without the overarching legitimacy or hegemony, or whatever you want to call it. I did a piece for the New Left Review, which was called The New Neoliberalism. Despite saying I'm not a Marxist, the New Left Review do occasionally let
I'm not
me...
a Marxist, I just hang out with them.
But anyway, they sort of edit you until you kind of are a Marxist eventually. But no, it was called The New Neoliberalism, and I tried to distinguish a spirit of the current regime, which I call punitive neoliberalism, which was a kind of neoliberalism which was no longer based around norms of fairness and evidence gathering and reason, and instead one that was imbued with a slightly more, I guess, kind of Nietzschean spirit of stamping on the weak to some extent, which has, I think, been there within some Austrian visions of neoliberalism, going back to von Mises and others and so on. And that is in some ways the giving up of it's kind of capitalism without liberalism. So you could say it's sort of neoliberalism, but not liberalism in a way. One of the things that interests me a lot at the moment is, well, partly what some scholars have been calling the asset economy, which is basically the idea that advantage, disadvantage, stratification is becoming more based around access to assets, particularly housing assets. Obviously, this is the work of Melinda Cooper and Martin Koenigs and Lisa Adkins and others. And I think this is really, really interesting because effectively it's displacing labour from the explanation of how inequality, or displacing the labour market and the workplace and so on. Now, I think the work and the labour market clearly are, key parts of society and our lives and so on. But I think what's interesting to me is how does capitalism carry on justifying itself? What kinds of promises are made or not made, unbroken, in a society where you can't work your way to security or to dignity a lot of the time? I think that's one of the really pressing questions of our time. And in that sense, I think so this is I haven't given you the ism that comes with this, but I am interested in that some of the sort of affective and sort of ethical and existential questions that arise from that. One of the things I'm doing at the moment, I've just got an article coming out quite soon about this, is trying to do a little bit like what I did with the happiness industry, which was my book about happiness and mental health in 2015. But I've more recently been working on anxiety, which is nobody saw this coming, but since 2008, anxiety disorders have become not just the dominant mental health disorder of our society, but actually in some ways the greatest contributor to what the World Health Organization calls the burden of ill health in the whole world, actually. And this was unexpected. Psychiatrists didn't see this coming. The psychologists don't really pay attention to this kind of stuff, and yet it's everywhere. We see it all around us. We see it in schools, workplaces, universities, and so on, and it disproportionately afflicts the young and disproportionately afflicts women. Now, of course, there's a kind of social media smartphone story about that, and Jonathan Haidt's the Anxious Generation kind of goes into a lot of that, and I wrote sort of semi-sympathetically about that for the London Review of Books. But I think that what we need to do is to try and knit together this as a kind of affective disposition of our times with some of the sort of speculative logics that have taken hold in a capitalism that is no longer based around, earnings, basically. Earning in the sense of like, you did this much work, here's what you're going to get rewarded with it, and that you get a sense of existential security in that kind of a society. You look at the way in which universities are now, set up to basically as around a speculative logic, which is, well, if you do this degree, over the next 40 years of your life, you're going to be getting these kinds of returns on your investment, turning everyone into a sort of speculator on the future.
But you better hope nothing bad or unexpected happens.
No, absolutely, exactly. And, and you also are going to be paying a higher rate of marginal tax than, than bankers and so on. So anyway, I mean, that's the kind of, these are some of the questions I'm interested in now. I haven't yet knitted that together into a sort of thesis or an ism, but I have got an idea for a book. I'm going to try and bring that together in the next few years.
I'm really excited for it. As a person of anxiety, I'm very excited to read it. Will Davies, thank you so much for joining us on Downstream.
Thanks, Ash.